today. We have participants from Canada, Australia, Africa, and the Middle East. Thank you all. My name is Ajibade Ibino, and I am a senior lecturer here in cost management at the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Melbourne. In today's seminar, we will be looking at the topic, achieving best value for money from projects. And just to let you know again that this webinar is co-hosted with the Institute of Value Management Australia. And here's the agenda for today. First of all, we are going to have a talk on value and value for money principle, and that will be done by Rob Barton. And then there will be a project example, and this will be followed by another example in the context of public-private partnership. And then we will talk a bit about research in this area very briefly, and we will have about 20 minutes of Q&A, and then the conclusion and the wrap up.
Okay, so I'm going to be speaking then about value and value for money, and really I'm presenting now the principles of this, so that when we look at the examples which both Mark and Jose will present, so there'll be context for that. So these are the principles that we've described in our current paper, which is published in the PMI journal. Seemingly everyone seeks best value for money at the supermarket, at the restaurant, in all procurement, in statements of project requirements, in design briefs, in just about everything, people are seeking best value for money. Now, this is the thing, that the term value is used in so many different ways, with so many potentially different meanings, that there are always numerous views about why a particular entity has value. Further, adding to the confusion is that often cost and price get mixed up with the whole notion of value. When I was writing my PhD many, many years ago, I dealt with this issue head on. And I was trying to establish something which would be very, very clear, as opposed to the confused mixed language that we often find and still do find in terms of value and value for money. And I came across, whilst I was doing my research, the works of Daniel Bernoulli, the philosopher, famous philosopher and mathematician, who in 1738 wrote this, that the value of an item must not be based on its price, but rather on the utility which it yields. So here we have clear separation between the value and the money. The money, of course, the cost, the price on one hand, and the usefulness or the utility which it yields, that's where the value actually lies. And it was this statement by Bernoulli, more than anything else, that guided my thinking at the time of writing my PhD, and to this day still does in my regular practice, the separation of value and the separation from value from money. So firstly, I'm talking about value. Why is anything then of value? I'm not talking about money now. I'm talking about why is it of value in the context of what Bernoulli was saying. What we found is that we can identify three core factors that determine why something has a value. First, it fulfills some useful purpose. Second, as a result of fulfilling that purpose or purposes, there will be beneficial outcomes. And third, there will be important features related to the particular entity that we're considering. Now, this is the thing, but when we're dealing with projects, there are many, many people involved. So it's not just a task that some person can sit down and write this out for the project, because there are many perceptions of what the useful purposes are, including the primary purpose, which I'll come to in a moment. There are many perceptions of the expected benefits, and there are a huge number of perceptions about important features, because simply what might be important to me may be of no importance to you whatsoever. So we're seeing those multiple perceptions, and this is why we want our workshops to bring people together to capture those perceptions. If we think of this train, or perhaps the service that the train delivers for a moment, we'll get the idea. Just considering the views of one, just as an example, the views of the passenger. Why does this train have value to the passenger? Well, first, it takes me from A to B. That's its primary purpose. And if it doesn't do that, then it's got no useful purpose to this particular passenger. Of course, it might have to other passengers, but not to this one. One benefit of this, it gets me to work on time. And something which is important would be things like regularity, frequency, reliability. And clearly a train or train service which is more reliable, more regular, and more frequent is of more value than one which is less regular, less reliable, and less frequent. So keep that picture in mind. Now we could, if we were really doing the train service, we would map out the perceptions of a number of stakeholders, not just the passengers. Now, what this leads to then is a value statement, which is a collection of the value factors gathered in that, what I call the value triangle. In the paper that we've published, we refer specifically to the value triangle. So it's the useful purposes, the beneficial outcomes, and the important features. Now, the value statement is something which we do right at the start of every exercise in achieving best value for money. It's always our starting point. The value statement is a guide to decision making in planning and design. It forms the basis for comparisons in determining best value for money. So please keep that value statement in mind. The first thing to do in preparing a value statement, this is really, really important now, is to construct and agree to the primary purpose of the entity. When my colleague Mark, who you've met just a few months ago, and I were doing a large exercise for a new hospital in Singapore, for example, there were 70 people in the room, 70. That included professors of medicine, doctors, nurses, health planners, administrators, architects, engineers. And our first task was to get them all focused on a statement of primary purpose. That's what we had to do. But once we've got that done, then everything else can feed back to that primary purpose statement. And that is the key criteria in determining best value for money, having a clear statement of primary purpose. After that, we can proceed to complete the value triangle. So that's what the paper is on about in terms of its principles for value. When it comes to value for money, what we mean is simply this. We now know where our value is. Our value is on the left-hand side of this diagram. It's captured in that value triangle or the value statement. On the right-hand side is the money. Here's the value and here's the money. Simple as that. Keep in mind that the Bernoulli statement, that the value of an item is not to be found in the money, in the price paid. It is in the utility, which I'm capturing in that value triangle. That's where the value is. So value for money then, here's the value, here's the money. And the process is simply one of comparing each of the options. We're going to select a number of options to ways we could potentially fulfill the value triangle. And each one of the options will give us more or less value for more or less money. Some of those options might give far more than what is required, and some of them might give a little less. So there might be one example, for example, to give 95% of that value triangle, but it costs 50%, and so we would, of the cost, so we would like you to say, well, that's probably better value for money. Find some other way of doing the extra 5%, and you'll get a much better outcome. I noticed there's a number of people participating or registered from BHP, and thank you very much for joining us, you guys. And so I've put this slide in specifically for you because your value statement is really a fundamental core part of what you call the SOR, your statement of requirements. And in that case, we're looking for statement of requirements. And of course, within mining, you're typically going to be using NPVs rather than capital costs, whereas in normal construction, we're focusing on capital costs. But in mining, it's NPV. So this diagram is for you guys. It's more or less of the SOR for more or less money or the NPV. It's exactly the same idea that I've been speaking. Now, the process is simply this. We set up the value statement. That's always the first thing, beginning with the primary purpose. The second thing is that we then identify options. The next one is that we assess the value provided by each option, 85%, 100%, 95%, 150%. We assess the cost of each option. Then, once we've got that, then we do the comparison. And once we've got them all lined up together, we make judgments. Value for money decisions are always about making judgments, comparing options and making a judgment as to which one gives us the best value for money. So that's the principle that we're working on. That's what we've written about in our paper. I'll stop the share screen now. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Mark, who will provide an example of how we've used that approach to help a client achieve best value for money. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. The example I want to use is actually a hospital project in Australia. It was a large complex site up in Brisbane, one of our major capital cities. And this particular site was being redeveloped. They were going to change and improve the facility layout across the whole of the site. It had a couple of hospitals on there, including a women's hospital, children's hospital, as well as the main hospital. And in its redevelopment strategy, of course, as usual, governments allocate and control budgets for these things. So there was a notional capital budget had been established for doing stage one. And they'd already done some initial site clearing to create a space to build this new major general hospital, as well as the new women's hospital as stage one. It would involve leaving some remnant parts of the operations of the hospital in other older buildings until the next stage could proceed. And so we're at the stage of looking at the schematic design for these first two new buildings, and the value management review process, which had already identified what it was being valued. So we'd already established the components of the value statement. And it was when we were actually starting to look at the design treatments that had been offered by the team that the chief executive of the hospital raised an important concern. And that was that there were still operating areas of the hospital would have to be sustained in these other locations for much, much longer. And it was the operating cost penalty they would pay for maintaining those services, which worked out to be something of the order of about $10 million a year, although they didn't know that exact number in the session. But they knew what the capital cost was going to be in terms of the budget estimates. And so the design team had designed to that budget, but it was under challenge in the process that where they were not convinced that they were getting sufficient value for money. When it comes to the crunch, in terms of understanding what was of value, the hospital operating team considered that the operating costs of the hospital and having a coherent set of services was more important. So the design team were keen simply to move on and get ahead and complete their design and get the hospital built. But of course, that discussion in the session led to an important outcome in terms of recognising that they weren't getting best value for money by proceeding in that direction. It turned out that by adding a couple of extra floors to each of these two initial buildings, they would actually be able to move these remnant parts of operating facilities into the new facility earlier than planned. It also, by the way, then allowed them to complete other demolition works and clear a bigger site and to actually construct both the children's hospital and a comprehensive cancer centre years earlier than they might otherwise have been able to achieve. They went to the government the week after the workshop, and the government agreed that the better value for money was to spend an extra $36 million in capital upfront, because it was going to save them at least $10 million a year in recurrent costs over the next decade. So it's understanding where the value lies is a critical issue in making sure that the solution from the client and all the various stakeholders is actually a value for money outcome and not just let's get the project done. So understanding what's driving people, making sure that the whole team coherently appreciates what is of value, both the purpose of the facilities as well as the various components, the benefits intended. And of course, when you look at a breakdown of this particular hospital project, the long-term most important purpose of the hospital is actually to improve the health of the community. And as it turns out, by spending some more capital earlier, saving recurrent money, they're actually able to provide better health services much earlier to their population. So that's where the exercise is so critical. If you don't have that reference to what's of value, as opposed to what things are just costing, you can certainly head down a pathway which generates inappropriate outcomes. The other example I just want to briefly mention relates to the Pacific Highway, which runs between Sydney and Brisbane. What is it, Roy? It's about 1,200 kilometres or some ridiculously long distance. And
of that order, yeah, of that order.
Thank you. And this is to upgrade the highway to motorway standard, having 2 or 3 lanes, in some situations 4 lanes each way, to remove lots of intersections, to bypass towns and communities. The whole of that process has been a 2-decade process to build that 1,200 kilometres of motorway to this new standard. And all of that was value managed by engaging with the community and the stakeholders to work out where the road would go, what form it would take, how to protect elements of the environment for the different way in which it could be constructed, as to whether it was on grade or whether it would be cut and cover or a tunnel or a bridging structures or whatever. And by working with the communities involved to appreciate how to do the bypasses, how to avoid important environmental factors or areas, but to also work with the commercial farms and other communities in the way that they need to be sustained while these projects of this type occur. So over a full 20-year period, because it was being funded by both the state governments and federal governments, this has been gradually implemented with multiple contractors working on it over different segments, and being able to deal with all the engineering issues, environmental factors, and community and commercial economic issues, because they understood what was of value. So I'm pleased to hear receive any questions that come from just those couple of brief examples, please. And I'm happy to pass over to Jose.
I'm presenting an example of how public-private partnership projects are approved. Basically by showing how the value triangle can be used for PPP approval. Okay. Well, here is the value triangle again, and I would like to highlight 2 things. Usually, when you have a public service, you might have a clear knowledge or idea of what is the useful purpose and what is the beneficial outcome. And then the question that now arises is, should we use a PPP option in which the private entity, a private consortium, will design, build, operate, and transfer that infrastructure or that facility, or a traditional option in which the private sector will only build, it's a traditional procurement, and then the public sector will be the one designing, conceptualizing, operating, well, and then managing the whole infrastructure. So that's the key issue. We have the value for a public service, and then the money options, 2 options, the private one and the public one. So here is how we usually talk about the money alternatives. First, we have the best private bid. That's the money that we selected, assuming that is the best option from all the private options when you do a competitive auction. And then you need to compare it with something that is called a public sector comparator. And what is that? Basically, it's a cost estimation that the government will pay if they think that they can deliver it by itself. So they want to compare the private option with an estimation of an exactly same public option. And then how you make those costs using what is called a net present cost, whole of life net present cost, which is the cost in today's value of all the future life cycle cost flows. For example, we discussed that these kind of projects are usually contracts of 25 years. Well, we want to know in today's money, what will be the cash of all those future 25 years of spending, okay? So if we go a little bit deeper into how to estimate this, we will have this comparison. So what we want to know here in order to say that a PPP option is better is to say that the net present cost of the best private bid should be lower than the net present cost of the public sector comparator. And this is how you create this net present cost of the public sector comparator. On one side, you have the total private bid, you have the total price for that, and on the other side, you have to estimate how will that same project be delivered by the government. And for that, you estimate the direct cost of the infrastructure, you estimate the demand, you estimate the risks and the risks that you want to transfer, and you also want to consider the competitive neutrality, which is basically to ensure that extra cost that ensures that the government business do not enjoy any competitive advantages, simply because they have a public ownership. For example, taxes. You need to make some arrangement in order to make the two options comparable. So once you have that, you can say that you have certain savings, as you can see in the slide, and that saving is what makes a PPP option to be approved when compared to the same project as a public option. So I want to just show you an example of the Royal Women's Hospital, and this is basically what is inside a report of the Victorian Auditor General. This is a redevelopment project. It was a design, build, finance, maintain option, 250 million in capital funds, 25 years operating phase, that's the contract, 421 million in net present value. So what is possible to see in this report? First, here is how the public sector comparator, you can see in the last column, was estimated, because they were estimating for each stage the raw, basically the direct cost of the public sector comparator. Then they estimated the transferred risks that were transferred, and then the competitive neutrality. It came up to a total amount of 356 million, and that was the final closure. So then at the end, when they need to decide whether to do it through a PPP or through a public procurement, that's the number in net present cost that they got for the public option. And then they said, well, they make some adjustment, but then they have to decide and say, well, the final public sector comparator is 367. The best private bid at financial closure after negotiation was 365 million, a difference of 2.46 million, which makes a savings of 0.77%. Okay, so that's, you can see in the report how this was presented as the option that required less money for providing exactly the same value. Something is missing, and with this I finish, is that one part of the value triangle was missing, important features. What I would like to highlight here is that the important feature, it is present in the regulation by two things. First, they use it to adjust the public sector comparator. For example, it's in the report, they noted that the innovation that the private bid presented make the public sector comparator to be adjusted, because it was possible to see new things, basically important features that provide value to the project, but they were not considered in the public sector option. I hope it was clear. I know it was a little bit technical, but I'm free to ask any question you can have at the end of this.
Thank you, everyone. So what I'm going to be talking about very quickly is to just highlight some of the research that we have been doing together with the Institute of Value Management Australia around this topic. And we recently published a paper in the Project Management Journal. And I will just quickly talk a bit about some of the things that we we are finding and some of the areas for further research. And one of the things I would like to highlight is on this slide. So if you look at this slide, we looked at all the definition of value in the literature and in practice documents across the world, in an attempt to understand how value is being constructed. So if you go back to what Roy, Mark, and Jose, what they talk about, the value triangle, how you separate money from value. So we try to look at some of the, and one thing we found, which is very apparent if you look at my slide, is that most of the existing definition of value, they include cost or price as part of the way to measure value. And we believe this is not helpful. I mean, from a project perspective, from trying to understand utility. So if you go back to the original philosophical definition of value by Bernoulli, who is a philosopher. So Bernoulli said, the value of an item should not be based on its price, but rather on the utility which it yields. So in a project, you want to be able to clearly identify what those utilities are before you start to even consider cost. So looking at all the definition in the literature and in practice document, we discover majority of them has included cost or price as part of that, the definition of value. And so we believe that, we concluded that this is not so helpful. And so we also proposed some other areas of research. So the value triangle that Roy presented, also by Mark and by Jose, we, as well as the procedure for assessing value for money, we want to, I mean, in terms of further research, a way to implement these measures, so your beneficial outcome, important features, and useful purpose, implement this way of capturing value on multiple projects, to be able to see how it works, how people respond to them. Of course, from the examples of Roy's and Mark's work to date, people have responded to them very positively because they are more clearer, but we believe further research is needed to implement these measures across multiple projects. And also in the aspect of the decision-making procedure. So how do you go through these value for money decision-making procedure? What are the success factors? I mean, so we believe there is need for further research to further explore that procedure and fine-tune and sharpen and validate it on case studies. And the third area of research that we have identified is understanding the dynamics. So in value for money process, when you are constructing that value statement, you are dealing with multiple stakeholders who have different interests in the project. Political power could be involved, so much. So there's a dynamics of that relationship. So we believe there is need for further research to understand that stakeholder consensus building, how to generate those consensus, how to, and also in that process, not everybody will be interested in everything. So it may also be costly to involve everyone at the same time. But how do you involve stakeholders in that process, and how do you understand what are the success factors? And that's another area of research that we have identified. We believe will help to sharpen the entire value for money decision making. I mean, like I said, looking at the previous literature, looking at most of the practice documents, we discovered that many of them are not explicit. It's not explicit how this should be conducted and how it should be measured. So people talk about functional analysis. These are not so helpful. We believe they are a bit vague and not a bit ambiguous for ordinary stakeholders to understand how to, I mean, how they can contribute to the construction of the value statement. So these are the key areas of research that we have identified. And I think I will stop here. And now we will go into the Q&A session, and I will hand over to Roy. Roy, thank you, everyone.
Okay, everyone. Now, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. All you have to do is click that box, and you can type in questions, and we'll take questions as they come in. Whilst we're waiting for questions, we'll just continue dialogue for a few minutes, and I anticipate in question. At least I can't see any questions. No, there's no open questions yet, but still there's no questions coming yet. So would someone like to fire a question, please? And whilst you're thinking of questions, I'll get Mark to further elaborate on examples that we've found in our journey, which has been vast and extensive. We've had the privilege of working on major projects literally all around the world, mining, construction, processes, operations, all sorts of things, where we've been able to apply these processes. Just before Mark starts, I've got one question coming already. Okay, so this is a question for Ajibade and Jose. What is happening with value for money teaching at university courses? That's an interesting question. Hey, that comes from someone up in Queensland. What is happening to value for money teaching at university courses? Thanks very much indeed, Michael, for putting that question in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Michael, for that question. That's a very important one. The university, we are responsible for training future professionals, and I believe this is a very important area. And just to let you know that at the University of Melbourne here, we have been working with the Institute of Value Management Australia for the past 5 years now. We've had Roy coming to present this same topic to our students. So it is part of our teaching at the master's level, and we do it every year, every semester, and Roy has been part of that. The Institute of Value Management has been part of that, including Mark. So we take it very seriously because we believe that this is very important for the future of our built environment and project, and getting students to think in a more clearer way of how to measure value, how to capture value, engaging stakeholder. So not just the economics approach to value for money, but that stakeholder engagement capture. So what I'm saying, simply put, is that at the University of Melbourne, we are doing that. It's part of our course, part of our degree. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajibada. Of course, we're talking now just in the construction area. If we think of the university-wide, well, then there's a very big question. And, as I said in my opening comments, everyone is interested in value for money. The people in the supermarkets and so on. Wherever we go, I've never found anyone who said they're not interested in getting best value for money. Almost everyone is. And yet, university courses across the world would be virtually silent on the sort of things that we're talking about here today. In Ajibade's slide, which is quite revealing about the definitions of value management, I'm very thankful. As I said earlier, I've been working on this for years and years and years, but it was great to see the way they carried out that research with Jose and Ajibade and listed all of those potential definitions from around the world. And they all mixed up money and value into one. And it creates confusion, and most of the universities teach those models. That's the fact of the matter. And I'd like to see much clearer presentations from the universities outside of the construction area at the University of Melbourne, which is what we're talking about now. All right, we've got a couple of other questions coming.
Sorry, Roy. Just before you fire off the next question, there have been two quick comments in relation to that awareness, or improving the awareness of how value and value for money should be in the decision making. So the project management body of knowledge is an area where the Institute is making representations to try and get a more explicit section relating to value and value for money in the work that project managers undertake. And because project managers aren't necessarily related purely to construction, the project management is across all industries. And the second point is that, by way of experience, the application of these processes, particularly focusing on that value triangle, we've applied that across all economic sectors here in Australia and overseas, in the places we've been. It works culturally, but it works both at the mega scale as well as in the small scale projects, where, as Ajibada says, bringing people together to gather this information and make this decision making does cost, and you don't want to go overboard and spend unnecessary amounts of money, reviewing things. So even with that fine balance, very small value projects for just a short couple of hours of time of people actually improves value for money outcomes by getting the front end, that is getting that value statement out and clearer for all concerned. Because if everyone's working to a more common purpose of understanding value, you're going to get better options, better design, and lower costs all round. So it's definitely worth the pursuit up front. And yes, the other universities are picking up the theme and incorporating aspects of value management in different parts of courses, but it's not coherent and it's not consistent at the moment. Thanks, Roy. Next question.
Okay, thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming in now. The next one is anonymous. I don't know where in the world this one is from. It could be from anywhere on Earth, in Canada, from Africa perhaps. It could be right here in Sydney or something. Anyway, the question is, Roy, what would you consider to be the biggest shortcoming in the VFM approach when considering what you experienced? Okay, I'll get Mark as well to comment on this. The biggest shortcoming in the approach. I'm just thinking aloud. Sometimes our greatest strength is our greatest weakness, and it may well be that the serious strength of this approach is bringing together a group of stakeholders and giving them a framework and a basis to make a judgment. It's all about judgment. There's no algorithm. You cannot calculate best value for money. It's always about making a judgment. And so that the real strength of this approach is to provide that framework that people can make the judgment on. The framework being, we've got our value triangle, we've got our value statements. We're going to compare options and look at what the costs of those are, and then make the judgment as to which of those is going to deliver best value for money. So that's its strength. But its weakness would be, I'm thinking aloud, its weakness would be if the people are not making good decisions, if the wrong people are there, for example, we assume we've got the right people to make those judgments. Let's just assume that they were not there. That would be a weakness. Mark, do you see any
A couple of comments, thanks, Roy, I would like to add. If you actually go to the end game of where that decision is made to say we're going to proceed with something or we're not going to proceed, that's the critical point. What you want to do is deliver to the people who have to make that decision the best possible information you can gather and the best assessment of that information so they understand what it is their choices are. And they can make good decisions if they have good information. If a team that comes together on a project, and typically we like to try and do value management review processes before design is undertaken, but a lot of projects choose to do the application of value management or value engineering reviews at the time when design has been done. So they've done some schematic design. And the thrust by that stage seems to be the impetus of the group is to deliver the project. Whereas the mental model they must have is to deliver the best information and analysis to enable the decision makers to make the best possible choice of value for money. And having a big NPV is not always the right answer in terms of what is going to be the best value for money outcome. Because organisations making these investment decisions usually have other choices to make. And it's in a comparative sense. They're comparing project 1, project 2, A, B, C, D, or whatever, in terms of their options. And they're looking for the best mix for their business. And sometimes that compromise is better. As Roy said, if you can get 95% of the value for about 80% of the cost comparison between other options, the best value for money solution is to take the lower cost option because it gives you 95%, unless there is a compelling business need for that extra 5%, which you know is going to cost you a lot more. So to me, the fundamental strength and weakness has to be how you manage the required information and people into the process in order to get the best analysis and present the information that allows the best decisions and choices to be made. Because not all of the choices are made by the project team. So it's focusing on purpose, and being clear and having that clear to all concerned, and then allowing the client to understand what they can compromise on and what they can't compromise on or won't compromise on in order to allow them to make their investment choice.
And can I make a comment very quickly, Roy?
Yes, please.
And again, this is where research becomes very important to be able to understand the success factors and the dynamics, looking at that procedure and on real world case studies and more systematic analysis of that process and different people involved and how they should be involved, when they should be involved, how that process should be managed. I think from the university perspective, this is where we see a big potential for further research in this area to bring more clarity to how value for money is measured on project or for organizations or companies or entity, whatever that is. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We've got a question here from Darren. Darren is asking, it's addressed to me, but it says, you mentioned the hospital project in Singapore with over 70 attendees. Can you explain a little further about how long it took to get consensus in relation to your value statement and where the biggest barriers were to gain that consensus? Yes, I certainly can. I'll bring also Mark into this because we co-facilitated this. The task of bringing a group of 70 people to alignment on a primary purpose is obviously a big challenge because everyone comes into the exercise with their own perceptions of purpose. This is, by the way, is why what we do is so important, because everyone will plan and design according to their own perception of purpose, which may not necessarily be in alignment with their colleague in the next room. And so they're planning and designing with different perceptions of purpose. What we want to do is get everyone aligned in that exercise. It really comes down to very, very skilled facilitation, which is what we do. I mean, that's why people engage us to come and work with them, not because we know anything about their processes, but because what we like to do is work with a group and help them to come to a consensus. Now, so the trick here then, and the approach that that I use in this is to get people to focus on primary purpose, asking them, why does this entity exist? And we begin with the end in mind. You may well know one of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is to begin with the end in mind. So what I do in this exercise, we start with the end. We forget about the concrete and the steel and the claims, and we focus on the day the project team has left the place. Let's look at this now. Let's look at this living, active entity, this living, breathing hospital. And to say, right, we're looking at this now, exactly why does this exist? It exists so as to. Now, after those so as to comes the verb, and that's what I get the group to focus on. Let's look at this. What is the actual verb? What's the doing word that we're after? And we fish around, and maybe several put up, but then we come to agreement. And then we extend the sentence with its noun, the verb acts upon, as well as a few extra descriptive words. But going step by step like that, we come to agreement on exactly the purpose of this entity. And then we work backwards. Once we've got that, then we can start working back. And then every concrete pump and every bit of equipment that's on that project is there in order to fulfill that primary purpose. And that's what we stay focused on. Mark, do you want to elaborate just a little bit?
Just in terms of commenting about the time frame, 70 people is a larger group, and things take a fraction longer than you would normally do with small teams. Typically, we might work with teams of anything between, say, 15 to 25 people on most projects, whether it's here or overseas. In this particular hospital, 70-odd people, and we've done a few of these projects now where we've had fairly large groups. But typically, you can take them on that journey from an introduction of the workshop session in about 90 minutes maximum. They have defined their value triangle. So in a 2-day workshop process, typically that we run, by morning tea or just after morning tea, the group now already has clarity around purpose, intended benefits and important features sufficient to allow the rest of the process to flow, where you can start to go through reviewers, designs, do functional analysis or whatever's required in order to build up an understanding of how best to respond to and deliver those intended outcomes. If you're working with a small group, typically as part of a workshop process, it takes a lot less than 90 minutes, but generally you would say within that sort of time frame, you can get a very large group to have a consensual position around this.
Yeah, thanks, mate. But the key issue, as I was saying in my presentation, is to get them to the agreement about that primary purpose first and foremost. The very, very first step we do in any exercise is come to an agreement on primary purpose. And once we've got that, everything else will flow from that. But until you've got that, my encouragement is we don't move forward at all. Okay, we're running out of time and still got some questions. Here we go. There's one for you, Mark. Mark, have you experienced one industry being most mature compared to others? And which one? And what do they do differently?
Probably the one that's most mature in applying value management has been the roads, transport area. They've been very consistent, both because of core value engineering they need to do for some of their physical nature of the works involved, but they've been the most consistent over the last 25 years in applying value management processes as well as value engineering on their projects, small, large. So whether it's dealing with roads, motorways, bus fleets, ferries, airports, train systems, they've certainly been the most consistent and the most mature in its application. But likewise, the experience is that mining, the heavy engineering areas certainly apply value engineering in a more consistent way compared to other parts. So it's not typically being done in things like software development, and yet the same principles apply. If you want to create new technical solutions, design software, give systems or new services to people, you can use, and you should be using, value management methodology to do exactly the same.
Okay, thank you. This next question comes from Adiase, and his question, the Adiase's question is, if cost and price will not be a proper capsulation of value, if cost and price will not be a proper capsulation of value, how can value best relate to management delivery of capital projects? So any of the panel might want to pick up that question. I'll read it again. If cost and price will not be a proper capsulation of value, how can value best relate to management delivery of capital projects?
Well, just a brief comment. I mean, essentially, as long as they're focusing on what the business outcomes are intended, the business will generally manage its capital investment activities to deliver its optimal outcomes to the business. The expenditure of capital money, again, is a choice they make. They have a choice not to spend the money, so they can give it back to their shareholders if they want to. And in fact, I believe in BHP, the financial controller or the chief financial officer has made very explicit that their corporate view is if they don't have a better way of getting better value for money by using the capital money in the business, then they should give it back to their shareholders. So in terms of, if it's just the capital price you're focusing on, you're not focusing on value at all, because expenditure of capital is only one dimension. You've got your operating expenses, revenues you're going to generate. It's a whole complex view of what the business is all about. Sorry, Ajibada, you want to add to that?
Yes, I want to add to that. And again, I think that is a very important question because, like I said before, most of the literature we reviewed, we found, and some of the documents, we find that there is this cost and price in the way value is constructed. And the point here is that this is not helpful. So even though cost and price are important, quality is important, you need to understand these three to be able to understand value. But what we are saying is that in that process, you need to first of all identify value first. What value? What is the value that stakeholders, according to stakeholders, what they want to get out of the entity? So that is very important before price and cost then appear in that process, which is opposed to, which is different from looking at costs in the way you define your value and construct your value. That clouds your ability to actually develop a process or develop a project or develop or make decisions that actually give you best value for money. That's what we are saying here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Next question, it comes from David. David's up in Queensland, I know, because I know this David. Hello, David. His question is, many stakeholders are focused on CapEx, especially in political environments. How do you get stakeholder groups balanced with operations ends and users to ensure NPV is given the correct emphasis? I'll just start this one and then hand it to the rest of the panel to speak. A lot of our work is in the mining sector. And in the mining sector, they virtually only think of NPVs. But all of my personal background, my teaching at the university, etc., over many years has been in the construction industry, in terms of building construction. And in building construction, we almost never relate to NPVs. It's very, very rare, despite the fact that people such as myself and others have banged the drum for many, many years. It's essentially CapEx that's on the table most of the time. We've had some successes with that. I recall when we did value management studies on the Museum of New Zealand, going back a number of years ago, on the planning, design, and construction of that. Once the whole thing was finished, the next exercise was to do a value management study on the first year's operations and so on. But on all of the equipment over many, over the planning and design, the equipment was all taking account of whole of life costs, not specifically NPVs as we're using them in the mining industry, but in construction, that's how things tend to be. Ajibade, Jose, Mark, do you want to add further to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, in my understanding, I mean, looking at the current climate, I think things are changing. Although it is gradual, but things are changing, especially with the in the construction sector, for example, where now people are talking about data. There's a lot of talk now about data, and people are now, the industry is now thinking more about the life cycle, about the operational cost, and not just the initial capital cost. So I think into the future, this is going to change. I think it's changing already with asset management is becoming a very big issue because $1 spent in design, especially in our field, in engineering and construction, $1 you spend in design, for every $1, you spend $20 in construction and you spend 90 in the operational stage. So people are now, the industry, the clients are now thinking operational cost. And I think this is going to be more and more important from the design stage, because what you do with that $1 becomes very important to determine how much you spend during your operational stage. So I guess it's changing and it's gradual, but I believe it's changing. It's changing already.
Yeah, I agree with Jibade. It certainly needs overt thinking about at the beginning of the process to either define or create a concept for a solution, and certainly as you work through the design, that you actually make sure you are engaging the operational people. If you're creating an asset to sell it off to somebody else, there's a tendency not to want to focus on what the long-term life cycle costs are, because you're assuming somebody else wears the cost of that. But if you actually engage those people into the process early, they can actually inform the design and create a better design, something which is lower cost life cycle to maintain, safer to maintain, as well as safer to construct.
Well, just to add something very quickly. Sorry, that's okay? Do we have time?
Jose. Yeah, go Jose.
Just to add that that's exactly what happens in PPPs, and the incentives are created with different governments, and then contracts are for 25 years, and then it's not possible to see people that have the real skin on game, which is how the concept is called, meaning that the decision they make doesn't affect their future behavior. And well, that problem is very specific to PPPs. That's what I can add.
It's an issue that's specific to a lot of others as well, Jose.
Yeah, for sure.
And we've had several projects, to be fair, particularly some of our Singapore hospital projects, which we've done many of, where the agreement has been to spend a lot more money up front in order to get a much better return on investment over a 20 to 30 year lifespan. So we do have examples of that even from large construction projects. We're just about out of time. Michael, there's one last question. Michael asked the question, how can we get government and large corporations focusing on VFM processes again, noting it had more of an interest a couple of decades ago. It certainly did a couple of decades ago. The whole notion of value for money was on everyone's lips. The process seems to have faded away. We won't really have time to discuss that in detail, how we get it back up and running again. But I just encourage everyone listening to play their part in that promotion. We have promised a 1 hour webinar. I'm going to hand it back to Ajibade now to formally wrap up and close us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. Now we have come to the end of the webinar, and we would like to thank all our participants from across the world, as well as all our speakers. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Mark. And we would like to thank you all for participating. And just to let you know, this webinar is just the first in a series of webinars we're going to be running on this topic. And so please be on the lookout for our next one. And I would like to say thank you to everyone. Roy, any final words?
No, just to endorse what you said. Just thanks very much for participating, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.